We've had a long day that has probably tired us all out. And that's okay. We've got a couple more things to talk about, and then we'll be wrapping up for the day with Q&A and kind of go from there. It's, let's see, time-wise, 2:47, right? Okay, my time zones are a little bit messed up. And so still people coming in, so I'll just wait a minute more. Matter of fact, let's do it. If you got any questions now, let's take a couple questions while people are coming in, and then we'll jump back in because I got presentations. That's kind of how I roll. So what questions might you have here, either in the room in Vancouver or if you tweet me? If you're not on Twitter, I guess you need to ask the question why. But so it's hard. But if you're not on Twitter, I still love you. I just may be more likely to go from there. So anyway, So I'll look for here. But any questions here you might want to jump in on? Yeah, someone's got their hand over there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that there's one text in Scripture that says live the gospel. So which text is that?
Yeah, I don't remember. Did you just Google that? I mean, live the gospel. Just doing it live on stage, dude. I don't remember where it is. Yeah. Yeah. I don't remember where it is. So you have to find it. But yeah, there's this one that always amused me because I always hear people say speaking against the phrase, and then it says, but it's not quite exactly the wording, but I'll find it here. Hold on a second. But all right. I'm looking. Someone's gonna look up for me, and I'll get you an answer in a minute. Let's go on to the next question. But before we were done, we will have the answer. Yeah. Somebody else. Yeah, right here in the front.
Ed, why do you consider Vancouver to be post-Christian rather than pre-Christian? Coming from Scotland, that's a truly post-Christian culture, and this looks quite different to me.
Yeah. Well, I was talking about not specifically Vancouver, but Canada. And I think you have a period of time in the past where Canada, that the words of being identified, now it's in the 60s, the percentage of people who say that they're Christians lower in Vancouver, that those words had more meaning. And so we would say evangelical, we're not saying that only evangelicals are Christians, but we would say evangelicals are a good representation of born-again believers. There was a time when that was much more robust. I mean, we look in the seals of the nation, we look in slogan, we look in songs. Now we're sort of in a post decidedly or implicitly Christian commitment. Now, I would not say, and first of all, I don't think nations can be Christians. I don't think you probably do either. And so I'm not naive to think that Canada was this one place, this evangelical utopia, but it certainly had a decidedly more Christian heritage than it does now. So that's the term post-Christian is how I use it. Good, somebody else. Okay, let's see if anyone is logged in on Twitter, and then we're just going to jump right back in and get started. If not, let's see. Live to the web, someone is saying they're doing this live to the web. 1 Corinthians 9:14, I have been told, is the passage. Let's see what 1 Corinthians 9:14 says. 1 Corinthians 9. By the way, thanks for putting me on the spot. That was really awesome. I appreciate that. That's received they're living from the gospel. I don't think that's the one, but we'll find it. But again, thanks for that. It's really awesome. Very Canadian of you. I liked it. Good. Somebody else with a question, either here or elsewhere. Okay. Well, let's jump back into. I want to talk some and kind of. I'm trying to figure the sake of time. I want to hit two topics in the time we have left, and we're going to have about 20 minutes Q&A at the end. So two topics that we have left. One, I want to talk about how you might lead to greater multiplication in your ministry, and then the second thing I want to talk about how your church might engage in greater multiplication for ministry. And so those are the two things I want us to look at. And hold on a second here. I got to find the menu. And all right. And so let me start first about talk about some of that, what that might look like as missional leadership. We're specifically looking about missional leadership and how it specifically addresses is this issue of some of the transitions so you can have a greater percentage of multiplication in the life of your church. I'm going to put that in 3 broad categories. We'll look at them 1, 2, 3. We'll go through them rather quickly because I want to spend more time on the multiplication. A couple things, when we talk about a reconsideration of leadership, there are actually 4 things under this that I want to point you to that I think may be helpful for us to think about this. A couple of things is that there needs to be a reconsideration of the Superman syndrome. Now, mind you, I am aware that there are both women leaders and men leaders, and I think that's great and that's awesome. I'm talking about Superman because that's the kind of the archetypical idea. And I think for a lot of times, when it comes to leadership, there is this idea, and I would say particularly sometimes for pastoral leadership, that the key to the church, making it, doing it, being it, is Superman is here. And what I would say to you is that is very good for your ego. It is very bad for your congregation. It is very good for you personally to feel that you're essential and indispensable and all these sorts of things. But what I would say is that the challenge is that ultimately it teaches people that their job is to follow the Uber leader rather than to be priests, for example, 1 Peter talks about, rather than to be agents of God's mission, John 20 talks about, rather than to be ambassadors for Christ, 2 Corinthians 5 talks about. And so that's first. Second thing is I think we need to, if we're going to see a real multiplication of disciples and leaders, we've got to unleash some of these people into beyond local church ministry. I was recently preaching in Alaska at Change Point Church in Anchorage, great church, largest church in Alaska, doing great stuff. And the Sunday that I was there preaching, in each of the services, they did the same thing. Just my sermon was the same thing. They did the same thing. And that's their women's, and I'm not sure the title that they used. I think she was the oversaw the women's ministry. She was women's pastor. I'm not quite sure the title they used for her. So, but she was women's pastor, and they brought her up on stage and announced that she was actually, well, I guess leaving is not the right word, but going to be engaging into a new ministry. And basically what it boils down to this, because it was going to the state capitol. But what she was going to be doing is that the governor had put together a commission and a team to deal with sexual trafficking. Alaska has the highest per capita occurrence of sexual trafficking, largely because of some demographic reasons and the sinfulness of people. But what she said, and it was great because the church got up, and what she said was, through tears, was, I didn't want people to be talking about the most vulnerable in our society without Jesus being present in the room. And the church prayed for her and blessed her. Why? Because she was now doing kingdom work that was through and blessed by, but even beyond her local church. If you're going to see a real multiplication, you've got to have space for people to multiply in ministry. You've got to have space for people to multiply in ministry. So let me tell you the story of Bruce. Bruce is in my small group. I've had the privilege of praying with Bruce and Beth to receive Christ. I've had the privilege of baptizing them both. They've been on the cover of our national newspaper of record called USA Today, because they call me. We do a lot of work with them, and they called me and said, "Give me an example of someone who's like coming back to church. This Easter was their first Sunday in church," and that was Bruce and Beth. And later they became believers, and all this sort of stuff takes place. Well, Bruce comes to me recently, and he says he's a contractor, and he comes to me and he says, "Ed, I want to, I think we should do something. I think the church needs to start a ministry to minister to widows," particularly what he said is old ladies who don't know what's going on if their house breaks down, maybe their husband's gone, and so some unscrupulous contractor comes by and steals from him, and he's outraged by this. He says, "We need to start a ministry to go fix little things that they lie about, and then if there's big things, we can tell them what the big things are and give them a list of honest contractors, not us, we're not making money for ourselves, but honest contractors." And I said, "Bruce, that's a great idea. When do you start?" And he looked, what? No, I thought you were going to do that. I thought one of the pastors were going to do that. And I said, "No, that's not how we work. Is that God has laid it on your heart, and I want you to be a good steward of the gifts that God has given you." And so the end result is we want them to have that kingdom vision. But that means a shift from me to we. I want you to hear that this is key. There are very few things that I do. Now, I'm a church planner, but I'm a volunteer church planner. I'm unpaid by my church. I don't receive any compensation from my church. I am the lead pastor. I preach 3 out of 4 Sundays. I'll preach this Sunday at my church. But there's only a few things I can do as a volunteer. I work 10 to 12 hours a week at my church, and then my full-time job is writing and speaking and doing things for Lifeway Research. And so I got 10 to 12 hours a week. And I will tell you, one of the greatest things for me is it has forced me to rely on other people for almost everything, to help with everything. But it's been so healthy for the church. First, it's healthy for the church that I stand up and say, hey, I'm a volunteer too, so we're all volunteers. Let's go do this together. In other words, no one ever says, well, you're paid to do this. Well, actually, no, I'm not. So that helps. But you can't necessarily do that. But what it's forced me to do is, for example, I have I prepare my sermons, but I actually have a sermon research team that I meet with, and we work through this together. They're just folks who go to the church, and they help me because I can't put in 10, 15 hours a week preparing a sermon. I only got 10, 12 hours a week for everything. And so I've moved sermon preparation from me to we. Ministry is from me to we. There's three things that I do in the church. I preach the sermons 3 out of 4 Sundays. Number 2, I lead the staff. I meet with the staff once or twice a week. And number 3 is I lead a small group in my home. And the reason I lead a small group in my home is I think it's really essential to do that. I'm seeking to evangelize my neighborhood. And I talk about this a lot. Now, as a matter of fact, let me give you an example. How many of you have heard of Bill Hybels' sailboat? Raise your hand if you heard of Bill Hybels' sailboat. Okay. Now, you're not here if you're in Ottawa or wherever, you don't see that. Probably half the room have heard of Bill Hybels' sailboat. Don't you think that's a little weird? I mean, have you ever heard, does anybody know any of Rick Warren's hobbies? I mean, I've hung with him. I know some of his hobbies, but did anybody? No. I mean, it's just not normal. Why do we know about Bill Hybels' sailboat? Here's why. Because Bill Hybels' sailboat is the example that he consistently, over and over again, constantly uses of a group of people he's engaging time with so he might evangelize them. Well, that's my neighborhood. So I don't have a sailboat, right? I don't live in a place that's on a lake. Well, not a lake like where he lives. And so for me, I've got 8 neighbors. They all live, I got more than 8 neighbors, but 8 neighbors within 2 houses of me each and every direction. And I've sought to systematically engage and love and care and be in community with them. I'm not just in a neighborhood, I'm neighboring. And part of that is I'm sharing the gospel. And 7 of the 8 of them I've had the opportunity to share the gospel with. And I'll actually, in a couple weeks, I'll baptize the 6th of them, not families, persons, so 3 families. And why? Why? Because as we are engaging, we're living in their neighborhood, I have now a team of people, my other neighbors who have come to Christ, we're trying to evangelize our whole neighborhood. We are trying to reach our neighborhood. So I would always ask the question, if you want to multiply disciples, is how do we go from me to we? And then how do we go from personal power to people empowerment? You say, Ed, I mean, you said Bruce, he can go out and start this ministry, but can anyone start a ministry? Wouldn't that just cause chaos? No, it would cause joy. See, because we don't say that we'll pay for it. But at our church, anybody, and they get the blessing of our leadership, but anybody can get the blessing of the leadership. What they can't do is come and say, we need you to pay for this, but they can get it together and build a resource and build a team and do that very thing. So if we're going to see a multiplication of ministry and mission-driven disciples, it's going to involve some reconsiderations of leadership. It's also going to involve a rejection of clergification. Clergification is key. It's not a real word. It's a Stetzerism. I made it up. But here's what I want you to see. When it comes to clergification, is that clergification is the centralization of all the ministry into a person or persons who make up the staff of the church. Now this is, I think, really dangerous and unhelpful because what happens is we sort of have 3 tiers of ministry. Like there's lay people who are, they're whatever, and they're just lay people. And you got pastors who are kind of good. Then you got missionaries who are like awesome. And so there's this 3 tiers, right? So, and the top 2, we're paid to be good. Lay people are good for nothing. And so we got this real unhealthy. And here's one say, it's one mission. We are all called to the ministry. We are all sent on mission. The only question is where, among whom, and doing what. It's one mission. We are all called to the ministry. We are all sent on mission. The only question is where, among whom, and doing what. Back to what I started with, the Spurgeon quote. Every Christian is either a missionary or an imposter. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't value cross-cultural missions. And a lot of times when people say that, they really mean we devalue cross-cultural missions. It doesn't mean that to me. I believe if all God's people will live in the reality that they are sent, that more will be pushed and encouraged and and convicted, to cross cultures, to go to the Pokot in Africa, the Quechua in the highlands of Peru, the Iban in Malaysia, and I want more, not less, cross-cultural missionaries. So we need all God's people to live as if they are sent, because they are, and then ask the question, where and to whom am I sent? Where and to whom am I sent? And when I get that, the where and to whom, that's obedience. So here's what I do, is all God's people are called to the mission, are called on mission. So you say to your people and mine, you put your yes on the table, let God put it on the map. Just say yes to the Lord, let God place it where he wants you. And what you find is God's calling a lot of people cross-culturally, cross-cultural missionaries. We now for the first time, we have under 3,000 unengaged, unreached people groups. That's first time in history. We have less than 3,000 unengaged, unreached people groups. In this lifetime, if we would mobilize and marshal our resources in the Canadian church and beyond, we could, in our lifetime, have the gospel proclaimed to every people group. Doesn't mean every person's going to hear, doesn't mean every person's going to be a believer, but it means every people group, every ethno-linguistic people group will hear the gospel proclaimed in their heart language for the first time. And it can happen, and probably will happen. If we accelerate that, it'll happen in our lifetime. If not, just by the natural progression of things, it'll happen within our children's lifetime. So we see this shift. Now, a couple of things. I would encourage you to continue to change some language in your own church. I would stop, if you want to multiply disciples and mission and people on mission, stop talking about being called to the ministry. People ask me, Ed, when were you called to the ministry? And I'll often say between my junior and senior year of college. But that's actually not biblically correct. I was called to ministry when Jesus saved me. And that was years before my junior and senior year of college. But when we refer to pastoral ministry as the ministry, I think we devalue and confuse people, because all of God's people are called to the ministry. The only question is, what kind of ministry? So tell people when they ask that, so I was called to pastoral ministry at such and such time. But you know when you were called to ministry? When Jesus saved you. So when Jesus saved you, so change the language. Call to missions? Well, first, I think there is a call to missions. I prayed with people. We got a family in my church that we're planning to send out cross-culturally, probably to a tribal group in South America. And they are called to missions. But all of God's people are sent on mission. John 20:21, as the Father has sent me, so send I you. Matter of fact, let's take those two verses that we've talked about so far today. We started with John 20:21, as the Father has sent me, so send I you. All God's people are sent. Then we looked at 1 Peter 4. It says, based on the gift they have received, everyone should use it as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. So don't miss this. Everyone's sent, John 20:21. Everyone's called to the ministry. So, 1 Peter 4. So all God's people are called to the ministry. All God's people are sent on mission. The only question is where, among whom, and doing what. And so therefore we change the exceptional to the ordinary. So for Bruce, he's a relatively new believer. I just baptized him a year ago. He's like, so I'm going to be in charge of a ministry at a church? I mean, I haven't been to church in a long time. I was a Las Vegas bartender. I assure you, there was very little to do with church in my life. But God's changed him, and now I'm trying to help him see it's not extraordinary. It's the ordinary task of the ordinary people of God to engage in a wonderful mission. So it's that shift. It's thinking differently. It's moving from a priest. See, I got to tell you, a lot of evangelical churches look like pre-Reformation Roman Catholic churches, where there's one person who can understand the Bible, and they get up and they teach it, and they correct the translators. Can I just tell you, be careful. Well, the translation here says so-and-so, but the translators kind of missed it, and it means this, and I know you couldn't know that, but I have a seminary degree, so let me tell you why that is. You know what you do? When you constantly correct the translation of the Bible that's in people's hand, you teach them that they can't read it for themselves, because only you can understand it. We kind of had a whole Reformation about that. So don't disempower your people to engage and understand God's word. Teach them that they're priests. They can engage before the Lord. They can lead their friends to Christ, because he's the one mediator, not you. He's the one mediator between God and man. And they can be priests before the Lord, and you can break those cycles of codependence and multiply, ultimately, ministry and mission-driven disciples. So what else? A couple of things. Renewed focus on mission in the church. I would say a few things. First, let's move from full service to simple mission? How are you moving people to engage in a simple mission? You need a pathway to do this. This doesn't happen by accident. Now, I know that sort of we pendulum swing in the Church of Jesus Christ. And so we looked at the 80s and the 90s, and it was the John Maxwellization of the church. And then we had Hybels, and we had Warren, and there was what I call the Willowback movement, and we had all this sort of stuff. And now people are like, well, we don't want to be so programmed, and so we don't, John Maxwell's fine, but he rhymes too much. You can't have the dream unless you have the team, and now we're more organic or whatever. Okay. Every generation thinks it discovers theology, sex, and music. No one before knew about those things. And the pendulum swings back and forth and back and forth. And here's what I would say to you, is you need a process. And if Rick Warren's baseball diamond gives you the shivers, I'm fine with that. We never use it because getting to first base was not something we wanted to talk a lot about at church. Actually, we did use it. I shouldn't say that. But what I would say is this. If you don't have a simple pathway, by the way, Tom Rayner and Eric Geiger, who I work one door down from one, 5 doors down from the other, they wrote a very helpful book called Simple Church, which will help you to do that. It's to help you to have some of you nodding your head so you've read it, help you to have that process and that discerning process to engage people and lead people to mission. Help people to think that their job is not to be a spectator. Their job is not to be the object of the ministry, but a partner in the ministry. Their job is not to pay, pray, and sort of stay out of your way, but their object is to join Jesus on his mission. That's why we started with that. I hope you found a rich theological diagram that talked about how we're to join Jesus on his mission. That means changing from, if you really want to see a multiplying disciples living on mission, you're going to have to move from decisionism and ultimately to discipleship. And the discipleship data we have is just, the Canadian discipleship data we have is just fascinating and troubling and encouraging in some ways and disturbing in some ways. And I don't know, it's kind of fascinating. So we see all these things that are kind of laid out as opportunities for us to talk about. We didn't got to talk about as much, but discipleship. And by the way, again, go to my blog today, and go to my blog. I don't sell anything on my blog or anything of that sort, so I'm not trying to sell you a product. But go there, and you can read more about transformational discipleship. And then from mission statement and to something which has seemed to have disappeared off of my slide, but it really would be awesome if I knew what that was. Let's make something up. What do you think should be there? Mission, just mission. That could be good. I'm with that. Mission statement to Christ's mission. That could be it. Mission to joining Jesus on his mission. I don't know. There's so much it could be. Let's see. Mission statement to whoever wins, I'm going to give them a free book. Mission engagement. Okay, could be. Missional. Mission statement to missional. Now I can't find it. Missionocable. What is that? Is that even a word? Okay, let's see. Mission modeling. Okay, you could win a book with that. Let me see what we got here. Transitions to missional. Here it comes. And the answer is, and the winner is, none of you. As I was saying, from mission statement to Jesus' mission. Heretics. Did anybody get close to that? What you got? Just mission? Just me? What do you think? You think this is a charity? You think I just give away for the wrong answer? Gosh, this isn't like Sweden where everybody wins. This is Canada. Come see me afterwards. I'll give you a book just for fun, just because I feel gracious and kind, even though you're wearing a hat in church, which I really think would offend some people. What's on the hat? Blue Jays. Okay, well, there you go. Yeah. Listen, today's Seahawks Day. From mission statement to Jesus' mission, it points us to, again, showing and sharing the love of Jesus, Lastly, speaking of modeling, here it is. I think these things sort of shifted a little bit. Sometimes that happens when we move stuff around. So let me just kind of realign our priorities as a church. See, God is a missionary God. I personally join him on mission. That's modeling. I personally join him on mission. That's modeling. I lead others to join him on mission. That's leadership. And ultimately, I equip others to join him on mission. That's multiplication. So I think modeling, leadership, and multiplication are all essential, particularly as we see the season that we're in, when we have churches that are more passive spectators than active participants in the mission of God. Now, I've got one more PowerPoint I want to share with you, and then we're going to take some Q&A and be done for the day. This is actually one that will be most directly applicable to some of you who are trying to ask the question, how do we see a movement across Canada? Now, let me just say again, some of you have asked, because I have said on a few occasions something that I don't know if it tweaks your, or kind of catches your attention or disturbs you, but some of you have asked, why have I said that places like Canada are most, in my view, most likely to see some of the transformational movements of God when obviously I live in the U.S. Here's why. First of all, the future of Christianity in the United States, stay with me, it's not going to be the focus. The future of Christianity in the United States is not England or it's not Europe, and neither is the future of Christianity in Canada. People say that all the time. But Europe, people like fought wars and blood has been spilled and wars last 100 years. France was at one point the most self-identified Christian nation in the world. And then eventually by legislation, by law, by great punishment, and when they could, they threw that off and killed all the priests. That's a different religious history. And the religious history of Canada is different than the religious history of the United States. But what has happened with the religion in the United States, it has morphed in a way ultimately that I believe will cause the churches in the United States to wander with uncertainty for decades about what it is they're supposed to do to engage their culture. They don't know if they're supposed to battle it, defeat it, slay it, withdraw from it. And so it's a tricky time. And I say there's a lot of hatred that right now is dealt for this stuff. There's a lot of polarization around political parties. And I'm trying to tell my friends there, you can't hate a people and reach a people at the same time. I know that's a crazy idea. But I think that Canada and Australia and the UK and South Africa too, all have kind of, and South Africa is an outlier in those just because it's a developing world, though they don't like that phrase. They're part of what's called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So it's a kind of an emerging powerhouse economy. But when you look to places like Canada, the hostility is still present. We see that right now in the Trinity Western situation. So the hostility is still present. But in the United States, we couldn't have today an evangelical president because there would be such fear and conflict over what it would look like. And ironically, you have an evangelical prime minister. Now, again, this is not a statement I know. And I don't know. And what's fascinating is if we had an evangelical president, every evangelical would vote for the evangelical president. Yet some of you people just think Harper's an idiot. Some of you think he's a genius. And you're evangelical. So from our perspective, he would be like our team. No matter what he said or did, the evangelicals would support an evangelical president. And that's really bad. But that's another story. So here, because you don't have the power here. I recognize Alberta is an outlier. And I also recognize there's no direct election of a prime minister. I get that. I've actually read a book outside of my 9th grade U.S. history. And so, I know, and I'm not saying that we all do. I've seen what you do on the TV shows. Let's go ask Americans stupid questions and see their stupid answers. I've seen it, and all I got to say is 2 words, Rob Ford. He has been a gift to me and to all of my friends. And then the most recent Australian election where Islam was a country, that was awesome. So it made us feel better about our politicians. And the great thing is he's the gift that keeps on giving. But here's what I think. I think that, depending on how you count, the Canadian Evangelical Fellowship says about 10 to 11% of Canadians are evangelical. My number would be a little lower. I'd be more with Reginald Bibby and some others of devout evangelicals. But here's what I would say. With the exception of Quebec, which is an outlier, deeply in need of the gospel, and a place I hope that you'll pray for, engage. There's some good stirrings going on there. But Quebec is the largest unreached people group. The Quebecois, the French Canadians, are the largest unreached people group in the whole hemisphere now, North and South America, the largest. And as you know, I mean, just very, depending on who you ask, half of 1%, might be a little bit higher than that, but we don't know. But so I know, and I'm not at all, and I know people, and I know some of you are near, and Ottawa's got a much more of a mix, and I know that, and so I'm not anti that. But what I'm saying is that when you look across the rest of Canada and Australia and other places, you have devout evangelical Christians who have now figured out how to live in a post-Christian society that the United States is going to spend about 30 years waging a war and shooting at each other to get there. By a war, war is the wrong term. But waging a conflict that basically is going to pit evangelical Christians against the very people they're trying to reach in a conflict that's going to last for decades. That's not going to go well for the cause of Jesus Christ and evangelism. I don't think anyone finds you to be a threat. Now, there's still these, I get the Human Rights Commission, some of the outlier issues, I mentioned the law school, things of that sort. So I get that there are not issues. I get the recent, ruling about magistrates having to, that basically you can't have conscience clauses and exemptions. I get those things. I'm concerned about those things too. But what I would say is that you have an opportunity here, because even though 65% of Canadians self-identify as Christian, what they mean is basically a cultural expression. And they also get that there are these strange people, these odd people who seem to have been changed in some way that they are not. And they call you different things, sometimes good, sometimes bad. But I think ultimately, having been distanced from a cultural battle that I think you never really engaged in, but certainly part of that's multiculturalism, part of that is views of tolerance, part of that is a peace, order, and good government view that has just had a different foundation. I think ultimately, you may very well, and Canada, because of all the nations I've listed, South Africa again is an outlier, but you look at the UK, you look at Australia, you look at New Zealand. You actually go. Canada would be the U.S. would be the highest. Then Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. What you find is you have enough of a robust Christian community that actually seems to be among evangelicals growing a little bit. You're not turning on one another. In Australia, when there's a lower percentage of Christians do one of two things. They either turn toward one another or they turn against one another. In Australia, they in many places they've turned against one another. And so there's a remarkable disunity in the church where you have sought to come together. And I was so encouraged when I was with the Canadian Evangelical Fellowship President's Day, praying together. I got to lecture with them for a day and talk about some of the trends. To me, I think the winsome spirit, the cultural reality, and the passion for the gospel could very well break forth and make a huge impact on the English-speaking Western world from Canada. That's my hope and that's my prayer. And it's not just because I'm married to a Canadian, though that certainly helps. But she was not a Christian family. I led her father to the Lord before he died, so she didn't come in a Christian home. So that's why I've said that. So again, it may be crazy, but I just know historically that's often the case. And the U.S., if I could just say, and again, stop looking to the United States, because I know you don't like that, but you still do that for your evangelicalism. Don't. I mean, I know there's some degree, and you want to hear, and they're good people, and so don't misunderstand. We have friends, and I that's ironic after I'm standing in front of you, isn't it? Stop inviting me. But my point is, there are healthy pockets of this, but evangelical in the United States is a freak show, and I don't want that freak show to impact you. I want you to impact us. But that's another story for another day. Let's take a look at this kind of my last PowerPoint. I want to talk some, and we'll close with this. Actually, we'll close with Q&A, but I've got about 25 minutes before we get to the Q&A. So let me point to a couple of things I think will help. Pull up this presentation. I want to talk and some about church multiplication. We've talked about the multiplication of disciples on ministry. In ministry, I want to talk about, as we close, church multiplication. Now, if you recall, a little while ago, I talked about, I'm going to come back to this, about the transformational church loop and 7 elements. And I want to close with that. But I want to talk some about what it would look like to have more churches and then how it would look like to have healthy churches to do that. So very quickly, I want to go through some things we learned. This is from a book I wrote with Warren Bird. It's called Viral Churches. It's a study exclusively of U.S. and Canadian churches and church planting movements. It is not appropriate to use, even though people use it in Australia and things like that, it is written on a study we did. Leadership Network hired me to do a study on what's working in Canada and the United States in church planting. That was my assignment. I have it on writing. I wrote a 430, 40, 50 page, I don't even remember, study that was a scholarly analysis of who was doing well and who was doing poorly. You might find it interesting, by the way, that this was a few years ago when we wrote this, and then we updated it, is that it was actually C2C in some of its predecessor expressions that was listed as one of the most impactful movements. And now to see where it's come from, even when it was impactful when we started the study, we did the study over several years, to see how far it's come is really quite remarkable. I plan to highlight C2C on my blog. I think it's a model. As a matter of fact, I really hope that people and the English-speaking world too will sort of, outside of Canada and the United States, will engage in this as well. I think you've got a healthy model that has a robust gospel center with a winsome approach to others who want to preach the gospel and plant churches. So this study I wrote, and then I gave it to them. It was, Leadership Network has these very affluent donors, and they basically said, some guy, and I know who he is, and you'd know his company, he basically said, I want to know what's happening, and they said, well, let's hire Stetzer. And for 8 months, I had dozen plus people work for me, and we really dug in on this research. That being said, we then took it, and they took out all the bad stuff, and I know that sounds strange, but that was on purpose, because I actually listed, here are the ineffective denominations in church planting. Here are the ones that aren't doing it. Here are the ones that are trying and failing. And so it's a private report, never to be seen. When I die, I'll actually publish on my blog and offend everybody on the way out. But a lot of that's changed now too, because other denominations have, got back in the game, And for example, I use the example of the Vineyard, and the Vineyard has waned in its church planting over the last few years. The Vineyard was once a church planting powerhouse. And I have deep appreciation. My wireless network at home is named Wimber after the founder, because it's of the Vineyard. And by the way, my iTunes password has the word Canada in it. So, but you'll never guess the rest. So don't even try. But I'm a big fan of the Vineyard. But what happened is they were sort of, there were other issues they were addressing. Some of the theological, some shifts in their approach to a few things, and good friends were sort of being a part of this. And I got to kind of talk to them a few points along the way. But the Vineyard at one point was actually a church multiplication movement, the way we define it in viral churches, that they were growing at a 50% rate, with 50% to the number of churches and 50% converts to the third generation. And that was just in the 80s. The Vineyard would largely, depending on how you count, was birthed on Mother's Day 1980 when a guy named Lonnie Frisbee showed up at a church, and there's some powerful stuff, and you can actually see this on video. And so we see this birth, but it explodes to the point now there'll be hundreds upon hundreds of vineyards in Calvary Chapel. Similar movement, different expression, but they kind of blew up and just exploded. But the Vineyard, I wrote in there, would sort of have been out of the game in some ways. Well, now they're back. Michael Gatlin leads the Vineyard national effort. Phil Sprout is the new president. Good friend. I've had the privilege of preaching at the Pathway Vineyard, and they just needed to settle some things, and that's what happens with move. They settle some things, and then they move forward. And so you can't really cut a space and time. So what we did in the book is we focused on the positive. Not that there was a negative, but we said these are the things they're doing well, and here's what we can learn from them. And so here's some things that we learned, and I'm going to quickly go through these so we can have some time for Q&A. A couple of things, we'll just jot them down as we go, is the necessity of creating a culture of reproduction. And let's go back to the Vineyard and the Calvary Chapel and the Hope Chapel. In late 70s, early 80s, these movements exploded out of Southern California. Donald Miller, not the cool Donald Miller, but the scholar Donald Miller at USC, wrote a book called Reinventing American Protestantism about this movement. It kind of explodes out of this movement. And the Vineyard and Calvary Chapel are hugely influential in this, because this is where if you dress casually and worship in a contemporary expression, you probably can trace that back generationally through your movement, probably through the Willowback influence. And again, I'm making up the word. Probably through the Willowback influence, but they get their influence from Calvary Chapel and the Vineyard. It mainstreams practices that now we almost all engage in. When Chuck Smith died just a few months ago, I wrote an obit. They used it at the Calvary Chapel stuff. And basically I said, one of the most influential people in evangelicalism and the way we worship today would be those guys here. You know what they gave us? A culture of reproduction. that they oftentimes would later struggle with, but a culture of reproduction. They got that you needed to start new things. Wimber was a real passionate guy about church planting. And one of the vineyard has broadened there. For example, social justice is now a bigger part of their, if you will, portfolio of focus. But church planting is with Phil and others. It's really focusing on that church planting and evangelism once again. That's, again, in a lot of ways returning to its values. But so Johnny Christ, who's a vineyard pastor in Atlanta, they've planted 22 churches out of their church in the years, about one a year that their church was founded. Why? Because that's just what you do in your vineyard. You start churches. Now the question is, can you really say that about, well, that's the way you are if you're PCA. That's the way you are if you're Canadian National Baptist. That's the way you are if you're Fellowship Baptist. That's the way you are if you're Mennonite. That's the way you are if you're Pentecostal. Well, you could say that. If you're Pentecostal in the 50s in Canada, you could say that. If you're Fellowship Baptist and, well, more a little further back than that, you could say that. So that culture of reproduction is essential to any movement that seeks to be a multiplying movement. And I would say, when I look to Canada, I see the C2C network as a thought leader and a practice leader in that sort of culture of reproduction. By the way, in the States, it would probably be ARC, Association of Related Churches, sort of a mildly charismatic movement. Greg Surratt leads that, and Acts 29. Matt Chandler leads that, would be two examples I would use that in a lot of ways are the vineyards of today. The Antioch versus Jerusalem principle. Let me tell you one of the things we learned. Here's what we learned. I was with Lutherans last week in Texas. Lutherans. I don't hang with Lutherans a lot. They're very serious, and they drink a lot. Whenever there's 4 Lutherans, there's always a 5th. Depending upon your background, you'll get that joke or not. Someone will explain it to you later. But I also speak at Acts 29 events, so maybe there's a similarity there as well. But what was interesting in just talking to the Lutherans a little bit about this is they're actually seeing some really interesting church planting taking place in some of their districts. But it's not with their established churches. And that's the thing I hear from Baptists and Pentecostals and others. Here's the thing I want you to see, is most of the time, not all the time, most of the time, most of your church planting is going to come from churches that were planted recently by the comparison to your other churches in your movement. Might be 10 years, might be 20 years. Why? Because Jerusalem is an example. I call it the Jerusalem-Antioch axis. Jerusalem becomes established very soon. Matter of fact, it becomes very culture-bound. As a matter of fact, it would later be called an Ebionite church. Irenaeus would write, and some others would write against calling them heretical, saying we can let them stick around, but as long as they don't try to spread their message which was this Judaizing Christianity, and eventually they would revert back into Judaism. But in the New Testament, the only time that we see Jerusalem sending out people is to check up on other people. Did you ever notice that? Not to check up, see how you're doing, but to see what are you doing wrong. Think about it. So someone from James in Jerusalem shows up. What are they doing? They're checking up to make sure those Gentiles don't go crazy. Antioch, on the other hand, becomes the great sending church. I mean, to the place now where people talk about being in Antioch. I was in Singapore, and they said to me, Ed, we want to be, Dr. Stetzer, they call me. Dr. Stetzer, we want to be the Antioch of Asia. Which I hated to tell him that Antioch is actually still around and in Asia. And so I don't think technically, it's like I'm going to be the Vancouver of Canada. Well, no, there is a Vancouver in Canada. But why? Because they want to be sending out. They want to send it out. They want to see this sending practice. By the way, live the gospel, I misstated, obey the gospel. And again, that phraseology. And as Romans 10:16, 2 Thessalonians 1:8, 1 Peter 4:17 talks about obeying the gospel, which we don't usually think of it in that context. So, we model multiplication. Let me say to you, if you want to multiply churches across Canada, you're going to have to be multipliers yourselves now. If the first thing that you hear about multiplication in your church, established church or new church, is we're going to start a new one and nothing else is multiplied ever, it's going to be a shock to the system that's going to be hard to overcome. But if you're already multiplying disciples and groups and ministries and whatever, then multiplication is just a natural outflow of even just the process of multiplication. So you've got to model multiplication. One of the things we found in our research, you've got to be born pregnant. be born pregnant. Now, I know you know that that's not physically possible, but it actually comes from I bet, would anybody know, where does that come from? Just shout it out if you know. TV show. David Gerald authored the episode. It's the most popular episode of a science fiction TV show ever aired. It aired on Star Trek, which premiered, by the way, on September 8th, 1966. I don't even know that's the exact date. But it was written by David Gerald. But here, it was called The Trouble with Tribbles. And in this Star Trek episode, The Trouble with Tribbles, I won't give you the whole story, but these little animals, little tribbles, and they're cute and everybody loves them, but they just keep multiplying. And they eat and they multiply, and they eat and they multiply. They eat and they multiply. And so they eventually eat all the grain. Because they eat the grain, the sabotage of the Klingons is undercovered, and blah, 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 blah. But still they're multiplying. So they're not mean, but they're multiplying. And so finally they figure, what are we going to do? They're multiplying all over the ship. And Bones, Dr. McCoy, finally says, here's what we got to do. We've got to stop feeding them because they're born pregnant. All I got to do is eat and they multiply. Here's what I would say. I really want to encourage you, as you're planning churches and you're sending out churches to be planted, that all of them would be born pregnant and your church would be constantly pregnant. Now again, how do you do that? Well, let me give you an example. When we started Grace Church, the very first Sunday we met on, first Sunday was Palm Sunday, 2011. I don't know. We had a good first service, a launch service is what we call it in the vernacular of church planning. And I got up that first day and said, listen, we're so excited here for the first day of Grace Church. And by the way, we're going to be planting a church every year out of our church. So this isn't just one, this is one of many. That's being born pregnant and making that a value in your church and in your life. And so I would encourage you to make that a reality that sticks. A few other things, okay? Let's talk a little bit about what happened historically here about giving permission. If you're going to plant churches, you have to give people permission to be planting churches. Now, not just to say it's okay, but to say it's okay and we're going to value it and we're going to participate in it and we're going to make it important part of what we do and why we are here. I'll give you some examples. There's only been one church planting movement. There's two definitions here. Church planting movement is defined by David Garrison. A church planting movement is a rapid, reproducing, indigenous growth of churches among a population segment or a people group. And we see this around the world. We don't see those in Canada. We don't see those in the United States. A lot of people say they have a church planting movement. Nobody has a church planting movement in North America in the way that it's technically defined. And so people sometimes say that and they want to be that, and I think that's good, right? So I can say, I'm smart enough, I'm good enough, and people like me, that's good, but it doesn't make it true. It's just I'm trying to get there. So there are no church planting movements the way we define it in missiology today in the soil of North America, unless you count Cuba as being in North America rather than outlying islands. And there is a church planting movement, verified church planting movement in Cuba. And by the way, I saw that on the screen. That was encouraging to see. You mentioned it earlier. But there was one, and it took place in Kentucky and Indiana and some degree Ohio from 1795 to 1810. And what happened was these Methodists started these classes, and they got these circuit riders to oversee them, because in the Methodist way of thinking, you need someone to kind of oversee the sacraments and sort of be the clergy connected to that. But it didn't keep them from planting churches. What they did is they have a class leader here, and a class leader in this town, and a class leader in this town, and then someone just would come by, consecrate the elements, just pray. But the pastor was the class leader. The Baptists didn't have the same polity. They didn't need somebody to come by. So they just ordained these young men who would go out and they'd start churches, and 3,000 churches were planted in 15 years in those three states. Crazy. Now, it actually wasn't all lined up with the Second Great Awakening either. This was a church planting movement. We saw similar stirrings in the 70s and more so in the 80s with the Pentecostals. We go back to both the 20s was an explosion and the 50s was an explosion. We come back to the Vineyard and the Calvary Chapel. We see that in the 80s. And so in our own lifetime, we've seen this. And here's why. Because those movements they found ways to give permission to plant churches in their movements. They gave permission. Now, how? Well, a couple of things. Most of you would say, well, they can do that, but at the same time, that's an organizational permission. You need a cultural permission. You need to value and celebrate when people go out and do this crazy thing called church planting and give them permission, give them space, give them blessing, give them encouragement. Now, a lot of it depends on your polity. Now, I'm not mispronouncing policy, but polity. Polity is how we structure our churches. So, for example, we have an Anglican, at least one Anglican here. Where are you, my Anglican friend? There you are. Okay. Are you the only one? It's sad being an Anglican. Lonely and sad. But you have cool hats when you go to church, particularly if you go to high church Anglicanism. But you can't just lay out and say, hey, we're going to go start a church. There's a process. There's a bishop that's involved. There's oversight. It's not like my people. My people, I got turned down to be a church planter by my denomination. I went anyway, started a church, just started blowing insulation as a job, starting a church among the urban poor, and that's how I started. Because my denomination doesn't have a polity like yours does. But it doesn't mean it has to keep from the advance of the gospel in the planting of churches. For example, William Beasley, who's a missionary church planter in the Chicago area, they have lay catechists that are all around the Chicago area. He's overseeing them like a Methodist circuit rider, and I had him come in and speak to leaders of different denominations and explain what he was doing. But he gave cultural permission and found a way to do so organizationally. If we're going to do this, we're going to have to open more lanes. We're going to have to open more lanes. That's a phrase that comes from Walmart, to be perfectly honest. You ever go to Walmart? Walmart's a little less welcome in Canada, but still present. But matter of fact, the smallest Walmart in the world is in Sussex, New Brunswick, and it is small. It's remarkably small. And when you go to the Walmart, any Walmart, I have a super Walmart in my town. It has 16 lanes that are here for people to check out, and they're never open. There's only one lane open, and I stand in it with 20 other people. And what's the answer? We got to open more lanes. Well, right now, when you look across the Dominion, when you look across Canada, there are small towns, there are big cities, there are ethno-linguistic people groups, there are First Nations people, there are immigrant and migrant communities, there are visible minorities, and there are some invisible minorities. And there is a great need for churches throughout Canada. And so how then are we going to get there? We're going to have to open more lanes. It's not going to just be people like us. Now, not all of you are even in that category, but kind of the professional, pastor, clergy, seminary grad. It's going to be people who are just led by God and overseen and encouraged by others and mentored and sent out and maybe do education in place. And schools are seeing that and recognizing the need for that. Tyndale, where I attended in North York, is intentionally seeking to partner with people along the way on their journey so that we can have that greater capacity. We're going to have to open more lanes. What kind of lanes are we talking about here? Well, what we're talking about is lanes like bivocational church planting, like ethnic or linguistic church planting, like lay-led church planting, like churches where multiple churches are planted from one planter in a catalytic sort of way. If we're going to evangelize, I like the way they say it in Australia, if we're going to evangelize into existence hundreds of new churches, that's their phrase, to evangelize into existence hundreds of new churches, we're going to do that with more lanes than we have right now. Why? Because we can't afford to just do it the way we're doing it. I want you to hear this. You can't buy your way into a church multiplication movement. You got to find permission and multiplication, and people are willing to take risks and say, we're going to do this because it's for the glory of God and for the advance of his kingdom. I'm sorry. I skipped one thing. Part of that's going to have to get over the fear that is. So there might be some church plants that are missional incarnational approaches, that are simple church or organic church approaches. Now again, I come from a very conservative people theologically. I tend to be the more progressive voice in a conservative denomination. I'm pretty conservative theologically, but as far as methodologically. But my people, when we see something new, right, we're afraid of it. So all of a sudden, there's a new thing, simple church or organic church or missional incarnational communities. Well, what my people do is we kill it, we autopsy it, and then we decided if we liked it. That's sort of our approach. Maybe some of you can relate to that. I think ultimately it's going to require some experimentation because you're not going to evangelize in Vancouver the way you evangelize in Alberta and have the same success. And again, this is, look at where we are. If you're in Vancouver, this facility is amazing. But there's not a lot of people giving away theaters in major cities. So Mike, if this is like your goal, you're going to be very sad. Be blessed if it happens, but how are we going to evangelize the communities that have now exploded between Hamilton and the outskirts of Hamilton or Mississauga? How are we going to engage in some of those places where these high-rise communities are going to come? It's not going to be by building buildings It's going to be by building churches that may not even have buildings. So we open some new lanes. What are some ways? Bivocational, language, storefront, lay-initiated, house, missional incarnational communities. All of these things part of what it means ultimately to be engaged in church planting. My time is about up, but let me share with you just a couple of things that might help that we kind of move beyond addition. I want to refer you to some things. When we did the research recently, there were some issues that we found. I blogged intensively and extensively on all of these issues that you see right listed here. We talked about the standard systems in church planting, which C2C, by the way, is a leader, and I hope you're engaging in the C2C systems. And can I just say, too, can I just affirm that what C2C is doing is holding to theological convictions and having an open hand to invite others who love the gospel to share in the systems without having to agree on everything that they believe. I am thankful for that kind of winsome spirit. But here's some stuff. You can find all this at edstetzer.com. and follow along on the blog. I'm out of time, so I'm going to, this is really awesome, but not for you. And so let me close with one example. I hope, many of you come from different movements. I think I heard Gord say that there were 12 denominations. I don't think I made that up. I think there were 12 denominations. C2C is going to celebrate church planting, and rightfully so. Can I just encourage you, though, to go back and make church planting and church planters the heroes of every movement? I like this from the International Pentecostal Holiness Church, and that sounds a little scarier than it is. They're just mainline Pentecostals, kind of like the Assemblies of God. They just have bishops. The IPHC, I've developed a close relationship with the IPHC, and the IPHC has a view of church planting that's rather healthy, and they do well. You haven't heard of them probably as much. They may be more like the AOPC, AOPC in Canada, and I'll be back with them in Cochrane. No, not Cochrane, in Calgary this summer. But so just mainstream Pentecostals. But they have a higher percentage of church planting, or higher percentage rate of church planting than any other Pentecostal denominations in the U.S. And it reflected some in their Canadian work as well. Why? Well, there's a lot of reasons why. And Bishop Thompson is very aggressive and passionate about this, and Stacey Hilliard is their church planting leader. He's a former Marine. I guess you're never a former Marine, but anyway, they do some aggressive stuff. But here's to me, they chose as a movement to say we're going to make church planners and church planting churches the heroes of our movement. And they did a silly thing, and it's really silly. But look on the screen with me. It's silly, but it's helpful. They gave pins to church planners. And you'll see on the left side, it says Church Planter, IPHC. That's International Pentecostal Holiness Church, Ephesians 4, 10, and 11. And then on the other side, it says Mother Church, IPHC. And if you plant more than one church, you get a pin with a diamond in it. I think it's kind of a fake one. These are cheap pins, right? I got them in my desk. They gave me one, so they're not like, priceless jewels. I took this picture. Or maybe they took this, but I don't remember. But the one on the right is Mother Church. And every time you plant another church, you get another diamond and another diamond and another diamond. And it's so silly. And you're already thinking, well, that's silly. But the pins were indicative of their passion. And when you go to an IPHC meeting, I've had the privilege of walking across and doing 3 regional gatherings with them. They make heroes out of their planters, because planters are hard to work. I get that. Planters are a pain. Okay? I know many of your planners, we assess you. We're looking for self-starters, mavericks to a certain degree, people who stand out against the status quo, and then we're shocked and offended when you're difficult to supervise and don't follow the instructions well. Duh. So what I would say is this, is that movements that make heroes of planters are movements that have a future. Because movements that make heroes of planters are movements that have a future, because what you celebrate, you become. What you celebrate, you become. And so I'm excited. I have the privilege of doing the AOPC, PIOC. I'll be with the Fellowship Baptists in November. I'll be with the EFRE. I just got canceled by the Canadian National Baptists. I just thought I'd say that publicly in front of everyone, because that'd be my denominational family. Talk to the hand, they said. It's actually funny. They were friends, and I've preached there before. We just had to reschedule. But what I would say is this, is I'm going to celebrate church planners, all those. But if we're going to reach Canada, by evangelizing into existence, not hundreds, but thousands of gospel-preaching churches. It's going to be that we have all hands on deck. We have networks like C2C providing systems and resources and partnership in the gospel to plant gospel-centered churches. Then it's going to be denominations that get a passion for this and celebrate this and make this their focus. And my prayer for you is that you would lead us, provoke us in the States to love and good deeds, according to Hebrews 10:24, because what we see here is a gospel that is separated from some of the foolishness and the drama that we're often associated with there, and instead it's planting churches that reach people, that plant churches, that plant churches, that reach people. I'm going to end my talk. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you. We're going to take some Q&A, but I appreciate you. So let me pray. Father, thank you for the women and the men here and in Ottawa and Regina and Calgary and all over. Lord, thank you for the heart and the desire that they have, that we have, to see thousands of churches evangelized into existence across this great nation. Father, I pray that we would hear of stories that stretch across from Labrador to First Nations people, to places we've never heard of because they're so small and so unpopulated, but not insignificant to you. And I pray that urban centers like Toronto, the whole GTA, like that whole corridor that stretches all the way up across the lakes, here in Western Canada and Vancouver and beyond, and up to the territories, so remote but so often in need of the gospel in places where churches have not yet been planted. For areas like Alberta, sometimes we think, reach more than the rest of Canada, but still deeply in need of the gospel. Hundreds, thousands of more churches planted, they're going to see change in the lives of people. So, Father, thank you for what you are doing. Thank you for C2C. Thank you for denominations. Thank you for people who aren't affiliated with either the Denominations Connected or C2C, but are here because they care about the gospel and they care about church planting. I pray for this movement, these men and these women, that you might glorify yourself through using them. And I pray, Lord, that in some small way, that because we were gathered here, your name and your fame would be more widely known because of our time together. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. I got a few minutes for questions, and I'll be happy to take them from you. And I'll look to Twitter. You can also text them to Bill if you're at one of the other sites. I'm going to look and make sure I get the tweets. And so, what questions might you have? My question is, why are you leaving, ma'am? I'm just kidding. Good to see you. Good. What questions might you have in the last few minutes we have? Yeah, someone's pointing over there. Oh, there you are. There you are. When you break the rules and sit outside of the promised land, you don't get immediately noticed.
Okay. So I was just in Cuba, and it's interesting. They don't call their house church, they call them missions.
Yeah.
And they don't meet on Sunday very often.
Yeah.
So those are two interesting things. In other words, differentiate between church and mission. And
Yeah.
don't have just meetings on Sunday. Those two things seem to work very well together.
Yeah, and I haven't been to Cuba because I'd actually get arrested if I went from my country to there, but lots of us have snuck over there. But yeah, you're exactly right. A couple of things that there's ecclesiological flexibility in almost all church planting movements. And so I am less good, because the Methodists didn't call their churches, they called them classes, because you didn't have a real church until there was a residential pastor. And so all those churches that were under the circuit rider were actually not churches. I think biblically they were. And I would say that those that call themselves missions are often functioning under some other larger church context. I would call them churches theologically. I don't care if they call themselves purple. I care that they're just doing some great stuff. And Cuba is a great example. We don't want to tweet about that or stuff like that. But the government's not unaware of what's going on. I just don't want to antagonize more than's necessary. So remarkable stuff. Yes, sir.
Could you just comment on Michael Green and the movement that's happening with him in the U.S. and could that movement that's come from England this way possibly work in Canada?
Yeah, I'm a fan of Mike. I think Mike's doing good stuff. I'm always cautious to use the word movement. I don't know that Mike used that. He might. But we're friends. I think I either endorsed or wrote forward to one of his books. I think what they're doing in 3DM is really helpful And he's an Anglican Baptist kind of weird combination. So he speaks more than one ecclesiological language, so he relates well. So I commend people to use Mike with some of the training. But yeah, I think that it's interesting because he's down in South Carolina. It's kind of a weird place for a guy like Mike. But what's happened is it's sort of caught on in some sectors. And so but I would say too, I'd also I like the idea. And I think one of the reasons that you as a Canadian would and should be attracted to someone like a Mike Breen or an Alan Hirsch is that because they're not Americans and they're from other contexts where this has already taken some root, and I like that. I think that that's helpful. So yeah, I do. I would look to. I would look more frequently to what God is doing in the UK and in Australia than I would. No, I wouldn't say don't look to the U.S. I would say just look more frequently to those other contexts. For example, I'm right now fascinated by what's been happening with Alpha. Now, Alpha's got some things that are a little different from where I would be on some stuff, but the genius of Alpha, of course, just Nicky Gumbel, he just winsome in his talks and that kind of stuff, but the idea of small community dialoguing and talking about spiritual issues and then having an invitation to respond, I think that's the genius of that. And so what would that look like in this kind? Now, so for example, you might use, if maybe Alpha's not where you are theologically, you can use Christianity Explored, same idea, and that comes out of the UK as well, or Two Ways to Live out of Australia. Matthias Media has some great resources that I find super helpful. That's the evangelism resources that I've used. But I really went far astray from your question. Yes is the answer to your question. I think it'll be good. Yes. Well, let me check my Twitter stream. Let me see if we have any questions. I just don't want people in Ottawa to feel, because they were just left out a minute ago on the list. And so, how do we find and develop church planners well and expediently is one of the questions. Let me answer that one, then I'll come to you. And that's from Mark somewhere. Now, Mark, if you're in this room tweeting me, we'll talk about that. But I don't think you are. It's a great question. And it's tricky because well and expediently are good ways to ask the question. Because you want to do it discerningly. But what I would say is in our own lifetime, my own lifetime, Mark, I don't know how old you are, but in my lifetime, I've seen the Calvary Chapel do this. And what they've done is now 1,000 churches. I mean, don't miss this. The Wesleyans now I'm trying to think of a number. What would be a denomination of 1,000 churches in Canada? PAOC has 4,000, right? I think they have 4,000. So I don't know, maybe, I don't know who has 1,000, but that's a mid-sized denomination in the United States. But in one generation, Calvary Chapel went from 0 to 1,000 churches in one country. Now, how did they do that? Well, they did that by having again, sports metaphors, which is ironic, Micah will mock me. They had a deep bench that they constantly worked towards and built up. And so what I would say is you've got to have a consistent pool of individuals. I meet with my pastoral apprentice team. I have 3 leaders that I'm trying to develop and raise up, are going to be pastors, church planners, or missionaries consistently. So I've really got to make it part of the DNA of my church to find those church planners. One of the things that begins to happen is oftentimes I find them from the harvest. So I got a guy in mind right now, guy in my church. I think he's going to be a great church planner. He's barely engaged. He hasn't led a small group yet. I think he's going to be a great church planner. So I'm noticing, I'm scouting out the talent that's there. And then the rest of Mark's question is develop them well and expediently. Well, I want to partner with institutions, right? Will Regent partner with me in Vancouver or the seminary in Cochrane, and again, or Prairie. I mean, any of these schools, or Kingswood University, will any of these schools help do that? I mean, Kingswood, I just spoke at Kingswood. I mean, they have partnership programs to help people develop their theological acumen and foundation. Not only do they have that, they're a Wesleyan school, but they have an Anglican track and they have a Baptist track, and so you can get the foundation you need in your own theological system as well. So I would then walk them through that journey along the way. I see the Scotsman coming this direction. No, do it quick before he comes, because I want to make sure William Wallace doesn't get his way. Good. Because just for the record, though, I'm from the Irish, and we still don't have the British foot on our necks, is all I'm saying. Scottish. Good. Good. Quick.
Historically, how have you seen God use schism and redeem it through church planning efforts?
Schism and individual congregational schism?
I would say denominational.
Denominational schism. Well, not all, but most denominational schism today is when the Orthodox leave those who used to be Orthodox. And so there's still people who are splitting over stuff. But for example, there would be, and I probably shouldn't weigh in on your theological controversies, but there would be movements here that largely have lost a proclamational gospel. And so sometimes groups of churches have sort of stepped out of that, formed their own judicatories, their own communities. So to me, I'm not sure that that's something that schism causes, but schism identifies. They would already be planting churches, but they just said, I don't want to plant churches within this denominational tradition because it's apostate now. Again, I hate to end on a low note, but I think it's important to note that, that people who lose the gospel don't plant churches. They just don't. And so if you're going to be a church planting movement, you're going to have a robust orthodoxy, almost without exception. You're going to have a robust orthodoxy, and that robust orthodoxy is going to lead you to want to see men and women hear the gospel, respond by grace and through faith, and be changed. And that's going to shape who you can partner with along the way. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow, that's